I'm just delighted to be here today with Addy at
Yep.
ekkolapto.org. And Addy is the founder and researcher and lead organizer and designer of Ekkolapto. And Ekkolapto is building a community of interdisciplinary talent through polymath. These are the events: polymath, cognitive hackathon, thinkerspace, and mindspace. And that's building on Addy's idea that art, music, and math are a cognitive science. So I am super thankful that Tomer Solomon introduced me to Addy virtually, and I'm really excited to meet you in person. And I would love
Yes.
to have you tell me how you came about, what it was in your background that led you to start Ekkolapto, what
Yeah.
it is, what you're hoping to accomplish, and then let's see where we go from there.
Thanks, Karen. It's great to meet you over the internet like this. Tomer's a pretty cool friend of mine, who I got connected through another friend. And when you first started talking, I'm like, all right, this is going to be kind of interesting, you know. And then you told me about what you were doing, and I was very interested in what you're building because I think there is this cultural shift, it seems, towards this kind of as cliche as it sounds, like a polymathic culture, more interdisciplinary collaboration, and not just interdisciplinary collaboration in the sense that, oh, I like music and I like art and I like math, but I'm actually finding some type of like functional connection between those, which is sort of what I'm kind of chasing after, right? And a lot of this actually, my interest in this started off because of some type of, I don't know if it was like an amnesia or agnosia or something that I had where I had trouble recognizing certain objects and things and memories and even my sense of self to a degree. And that was sort of a stress and a sort of signal or mechanism for me to get interested in these topics, right? So in a sense, I had to start to understand these things at a deeper level for me to make sense of what I was going through and experiencing, right? And then, as you kind of talk to other people in these communities and science and philosophy and the arts, you realize that there are certain of these ways that you think and experience the world that other people share, right? And some people will be able to utilize that because they're in the right environment and context to do that, and some people not as much. And so Ekkolapto, kind of short story. I started it last year. I think the first event that I did was like February 21st of 2024. It was in Miami, and we had like, I think it was just under 100 people that came, and it was a mix of like academics and students, investors, startup entrepreneurs, that type of thing, and also like some artists and musician people that came. And it was like, what happens if we just kind of mix these people together? And it was only a nighttime event. It was from evening to somewhat late at night, and so we had people give their presentations, do all that type of stuff, stir up conversations. And the purpose with this is I was filtering for people that were actually open to hearing people from completely different fields of their own, right? So investors are an interesting group of people where they are typically like, because they want to hit the next big thing or get something early on, they tend to almost be a little bit more open-minded in that sense. And then also, on the flip side, you have some academics or engineers or inventors who can be a little more closed off. And I don't know. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of this was just what you'd call, luck by getting these people together because it was a start of a really interesting movement, right? Because I think I put that thing together in like under a month. I don't know if it was like 3 weeks, 2 weeks, something. And somehow we got all these people together. Kurt had actually come down from Toronto to present.
Okay,
You can,
Kurt, Kurt,
yes, Kurt Mungle from Theories
Kurt
of Everything.
Trimungal. So you knew
Yeah,
him before you started this.
I met him at MindFest, which you should also totally come for. It's held at Florida Atlantic University by Dr. Susan Schneider, who's a philosopher. Um, so
Ford Atlantic,
Florida
Florida Atlantic.
Atlantic, FAU, yes.
Uh-huh.
And so I met him there. And interestingly, there's this place called the Sandbox, the Gruber Sandbox in the MPCR lab, right, which is also by Dr. Hahn and Dr. Ilan Barinholtz. And I never actually, I don't, maybe I'd heard about it briefly in passing, but I never actually knew much about it until Kurt had told me. So in a lot of ways, if it wasn't for me reaching out to Kurt and talking to him beforehand and then meeting him at Mindfest, things probably would have been going very differently. And that's just another example of like right time and place, like what it would have been happening at that time last year for Mindfest, right? Since that was in a lot of ways the thing that kicked a lot of this off for me is I had some VC thing that I was going to go for in Miami. And then I was going to send somebody else for it, and they weren't able to make it. And I was like, do I follow my heart or do I follow my mind? And I was like, I'm going to follow my heart to Mindfest and see what happens, right? And it was one of the best weekends of my life. It was really fun. I got to meet people who were divergent in their own ways, but we had enough of a similarity where we could talk to each other. And growing up in South Florida, I would say I was somewhat intellectually lonely. Maybe that sounds a little like posh, but South Florida is not the same place as like a Boston or SF, right? I think for arts, it's actually a pretty good place. For arts and music, I think you'll probably have a good time, and for business and real estate. But I think if you want to be kind of, you know, intellectual, philosophical, academic, it's maybe not the same environment. And I sort of found a microcosm of those people at the Sandbox and the NPCR lab, and it was one of the most rewarding times of my life. And then that was sort of the motivation and inspiration that catapulted continuously growing Ekkolapto. What had happened is I had this friend, Rachel St. Clair, who was pitching at this event called Imagination in Action at MIT. She has an AI company she's working on. And I was going to go for this other big event in Miami that week, right? And then she kind of just convinced me, oh, go to Cambridge, go to Boston, whatever. I was like, all right, I'm going to book on this thing last minute. Now I didn't even have a ticket for the event. I just went there by chance, seeing what would happen, right? There was totally a chance they wouldn't let me into the event. And I went, and it was also one of the most rewarding weeks of my life.
Now,
That's actually where I
what was that
first
event called?
Imagination in Action by
Imagination.
John Werner.
Okay.
We can put links to this in the description.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was when I first got like properly tapped into the Boston ecosystem. Because at that point, when I first did this in February, my mind was, okay, maybe I'll expand elsewhere in the US, but I was pretty comfortable staying in South Florida and building things up there. And then just, pushing myself to be uncomfortable going to Boston changed up everything. Now I spend so much time in Boston and Cambridge. In fact, I actually just drove from here in Miami to Boston in one shot, which was like basically 24 hours the other week, which was kind of fun. And it's a very rewarding place for doing stuff like this. And you find people that are open-minded and skeptical, right? They're open-minded enough to hear what you have to say, but they're knowledgeable enough to know where there might be a couple of gaps or inconsistencies in what you're saying. So it's a very productive place to be, at least for someone like me coming from my background. And after that, I had this idea about, all right, let's do more events. So I did a couple other things in South Florida. So I did this hackathon with the NPCR lab, those people I told you about earlier, and it was I think we called it like an unconventional computing cognitive hackathon type of thing. And it was really just an excuse about how many different disciplines and fields can we bring together for a short amount of time and compress some innovation out of it. And we had a student that came all the way from Ocala, Florida, which is the Gainesville area near University of Florida. So it was maybe about 4 or 5 hours of a drive. Say for the weekend, he had this interesting theory about applying or looking at cold fusion under the lens of the free energy principle by Friston, which was kind of cool. And he's like 16, right? So very, very sharp kid. Very glad to call him a friend. So I was doing stuff in South Florida, and then I started getting more and more into the Boston ecosystem. I held this, I think this was a thinkerSpace event at Cambridge Innovation Center in collaboration with Athos. And it was basically me and my friend Dan Elton were giving some presentations on things in synesthesia, language perception, biohacking. And we had 60, 70 people, something like that had all come, and they just sat and talked out their different ideas. So it was just really just a way to ideate, right? That's also where I'd once again ran into Hanan Al-Hazan from the Levin Lab, who is now also speaking at a hackathon I'm helping with this Friday at FAU. It's a longevity biotech hackathon. And after that, I got comfortable enough with the Cambridge and Boston ecosystem, and I said, all right, let's do something kind of bigger. So what happened now is, so I had this big one. It was the Unconventional Computing, Longevity, and Cognitive Research Hackathon, another rebrand of the Cognitive Hackathon thing. And we're doing it at the MIT Media Lab, which was really because of Dunya Baradari and Alice Kai from Augmentation Lab. I'll link to them as well. I could not have done it without them. And this thing was put together in like 2 weeks. Now, I technically still reside in South Florida, right? I spent a lot of time in Boston, but I was also here. So what happened is this was October 25th to the 27th, right? 24th to the 27th. It was Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And I think I got into Boston on like the 22nd, right? So a lot of this stuff was planned without me even physically being there. And there was a lot of stuff that was happening about, how difficult this was going to be to line up, right? Being far away, and then other things that were going on at the time. And, some of the speakers that I got who were, larger names were like within 24 to 48 hours, right? And then what had happened is there was somebody, do you know Vadim Gladyshev at Harvard who works on aging clocks?
No.
So funny story, right?
Agent clocks?
Aging, like
Aging
anti-aging,
clocks. Okay.
aging clocks. Yeah, clocks to measure like your rate of aging,
Yeah.
right? In different organs and stuff. And so a funny thing that had happened is there was this researcher at the Levin lab, Elena Sergieva, and she was there, and she was like, oh yeah, I know this guy, Vadim Gladyshev, he's this guy that researches aging clocks at Harvard. You want him to kind of come by for this event? And I was like, all right, sure, and then so that was literally like on that Saturday. Like I think she told me about this, if I remember, like in the afternoon, and then like 8 o'clock, something like that, he's able to come, like just super last minute. Right, that kind of spontaneity that doesn't happen in South Florida. Right, I was telling a couple of friends, I said, the way to get Stephen Wolfram, Manolis Kellis, Yosha Bach, David Sinclair, Vadim Gladyshev, Nick Norwitz, David Barzilai, Mike Lustgarten, Gil Blander, Kurt Zarmungal, obviously, all together for this weekend in some capacity. It helps that a lot of those people are in the northeastern area, right? It's not you. I don't think you'd be able to pull that off in South Florida, if I'm being completely frank, right? And so there was kind of a beauty.
I think the other thing that helps is if you get a couple of them, then all the other ones want to get together too, because they want to.
Yeah.
They want to collaborate. I mean, this is the big move going on right now.
Yeah. And,
I mean, the reason that eventually I started getting a couple of different people together on my channel to talk was that I felt guilty asking busy, productive people to come and talk to me when I didn't have anything to offer them but 200 or 300 views. But then I thought, well, what if I offer them somebody that I think they should be talking to that they would never think about talking to? And that's when I started pairing people up. And it was just
like a matchmaker.
Yeah, it was so exciting to see the kind of collaboration that can take place.
Yeah.
And here you put a whole bunch of them together. I mean, wow.
Yeah, no, and it was totally a team effort. Like I said, it was augmentation lab, and then I had my friend Misha, who's also part of the MPCR lab in the Sandbox. He flew all the way from South Florida to help. And let me tell you, I could not have done this thing without him, seriously, because it was me, him, this guy Safal Ariel from Tufts, who also does research at the Levin lab. Also both of those are like some of the smartest kids I've ever met, and they're like 20, seriously. And then there was the people from Augmentation Lab that had helped out get the venue and handle everything, right? But we were run pretty thin because there was a lot of things, like someone's laptop got messed up, and then there was all this stuff that was going on, and so the team was kind of stretched thin. Now, obviously, for next time, a little more prep work would help with that. But the reason I'm opening up about this is because people think, things kind of just run in this very straight linear path. Like, all right, that's it. Like, no, there's so much that happens even for just an event, right? Just even a simple hackathon event type of thing. All these crazy moving parts to handle. And I was completely blessed to have the people who were there with me helping me with this, because I absolutely could not have done it without them.
So here's just a process question. Did you find that when the speakers like Stephen Wolfram, Manolis Kellis, and people like that, when they came to do their part, to do their little talk, did they stick around then and talk to each other, or did they just come and leave?
Yeah. So Manolis was there for a bit, then he had to leave out for some other occasion, and then he came back. Yosha was, I think, there for basically the whole time till quite late, as was Wolfram. I think we actually hung out quite late, even after the hackathon on that night. And it was a hope of mine, but it wasn't directly my intention. But what ended up happening is we got like as Kurt would say, a theolocution between Manolis, Wolfram, and Yosha. And then also like interjections from the students around, because it was like a round table. And Wolfram, I feel bad for Wolfram, because Wolfram had come thinking it was just going to be a presentation and be helping people on their projects, right? for the hackathon. Now it kind of morphed away from that a little bit because it ended up becoming this roundtable discussion, for better or worse, right? And so we talked about synesthesia and language and autism, the difference about the academic world and the startup world. That's all like up on my YouTube channel, at least a good chunk of it, because part of it, the battery died. But that was like a perfect example of like, you get the right people in the room and the right time constraints, right? Like that does a lot. And people also, I'm sure, like interior designers and people that really know their event stuff think about this more. Now, for people that are kind of maybe want to get their feet wet and get into this, like you don't want to have a very large room, right? You want to have a room that's like just enough to keep people contained, but not claustrophobic. Like you don't want to be shoulder to shoulder and stuff like that. You want there to be like a bit of room for people to move around, right, and have some space to breathe. The thing about that, right, is we had a wide group of people that were coming in from biology, computer science and AI, math, physics, engineering, philosophy, right? All these different fields, right? And I don't know if they would have really had the chance to speak to each other if the room wasn't configured in a certain way. Because the room actually, like if you look at the videos and you look at photos online, the room wasn't that big. The room was it was kind of smaller actually, right? And the way that the desks were configured was it was kind of in this rectangular thing, and there was a space in between. But what that did is that forced people to kind of talk to each other, right? So when you have that kind of constraint, it makes it easier to force collaboration because you don't want to be shoulder to shoulder, right? And you also don't want to be so far apart. You want that kind of sweet spot. You can also think of this as like a collective intelligence type of thing, right? About the way you're compressing things. And it's just close enough where it's socially awkward if you don't start talking to people, right? And then when you start talking, oh yeah, you're a bioengineer, I'm an electrical engineer, and then we start talking a bit more, oh, you like this artist, or you like this philosopher, or you like this thing, XYZ, whatever. And then you start to get a depth across these people that would have never normally spoken to each other, right? And I even had a couple of people that were, I think they were just new to the area, and I think they just took a chance on this event to come to it kind of last minute. And they told me something along the lines of they never knew they were allowed to think like this. Now that's crazy, right? Like that, for me, that's like, I've kind of been this way most of my life, right? But to hear from other people that are, in respected positions and doing well in their life, it's like, is there actually like, is that real? Like people feel like there's something they can't think about, even just think to themselves. Because I have this kind of philosophy where it's like, I'm wild in thought but reserved in action. Like go ahead and entertain the craziness in your mind all day long, you know. Uh, but be more calculated and conserved and whatever, with taken aback by hearing that. But then this is actually a pretty common thing, right? And in a lot of ways, this is kind of representative of places that don't have these big, maker or intellectual hubs like South Florida. Right now it's growing. It's definitely getting better, but it's not the same as like a Boston or Bay Area ecosystem. But, to sort of sum that up, the event did go really well, as chaotic as it was. And of course, that was not just me. That was a whole team of us that had held the thing together. And it was a fun time. I think people learned a lot. I've sort of tried to keep contact with the people that were there in place at the event and see what they're working on. And they're all building up their projects more, or they're exploring different things. They've maintained friendships and relationships that they've had from the event.
Now,
And
this event you're talking about right now is the cognitive hackathon that you had in October.
Yes, this was the one in October in Cambridge at the MIT Media Lab. And I'm still sort of debating whether I want to keep using the Cognitive Hackathon name. I may switch it to like polyMath Hackathon or something a little shorter, depending on what I want to do with it.
Well, I noticed on your website under the polymath event thing that you were listing potential events in Silicon Valley. I'd be all over that. When is that going to happen?
Yes. Well, I'm certainly ready to make the jump to Silicon Valley at some point this year. It'll probably be closer to fall time between how I can get all that going. What would be kind of cool is to have, on the same weekend, we have one event in New York, then in Boston, then in SF, and then say in Texas or something, right? And have them all happening like at the same time, and then have one shared presentation day or something. Because not everyone is able to come for these things, right? Like for the one in Boston, the one at the Media Lab, there was someone that came all the way from California, actually flew for the event. And there was a previous person from a hackathon I did in Florida that came all the way from Orlando or Gainesville or something like that, who flew. And I was very interested to see that, wow, there's people that are still kind of following this and making that leap, even though it's far away and out of their comfort zone. And I guess the biggest thing that I've discovered with this is that there is this kind of interest in learning and connecting all these different fields, but there's not necessarily a place to do it, right? And it's, I've grown up on the internet. I'm Gen Z, it's very kind of second nature, native to me. But with that said, there is a element that you get from doing things in person, right? There is an element of things that you get doing in person. And it's very rewarding. You just feel like you're experiencing more a lot of the time. And so the next one that I'm hoping to put together will be probably around springtime. And actually the goal is to do it in some capacity with the group at Michael Levin's lab. I've been talking to some of them to see if we can get something sorted with that. And I tried to get some of them for the last one, but I think they were unavailable. But I told Kurt, I was like, this is when I think of like the top scientists alive today that like I actually genuinely look up to, it would be people like Levin, Fields, Hanano, all those people. Like I genuinely look up to them, right? Even if I don't, agree and see eye to eye with every single thing that they're saying, they have this sort of rigorously open-minded attitude to solving these deep issues about,
well, and they're
biology.
They're courageous.
Yeah.
Because there's some things that they're saying that are not allowed to be said.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, I was just there when Levin was talking to Anna when Kurt was just uploaded that new video. And I remember Levin made some joke about he can tell what field the person is from depending on like what he says, how they react to it. Right. And it feels good. It feels good hearing this thing out there. And maybe I shouldn't be seeking out things that are similar to my perspective on things, right? Maybe that comes with its own issues. But for what it's worth, it is rewarding to see people like that out there. And a lot of that is enabled by channels like yours and Kurt's, right? Like I genuinely, I don't think I would have even had the courage to get on camera and start talking to just the audience on camera or to you specifically like this if it wasn't for people like Kurt. Genuinely, and so that's the thing where culture propagates certain properties of itself in various different ways, right? And sometimes things hit you at just the right time that it sparks something, right? And I don't know. I think I do think the internet is responsible for a lot of this stuff because it's easier to find out information. It's easier to ask questions. It's easier to think for things on your own in a lot of ways. And again, maybe that's my bias as someone from the Gen Z generation, right? From Gen Z. But I think it's a really good tool and it's helped a lot. We wouldn't be able to do what we're doing right now without that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Well, so I have a Gen Z question for you.
Yes.
And then I have another question for you.
Perfect.
And maybe it's not really Gen Z, it's just a question for you personally. Yeah. So you've had an interest in a lot of different things because you have sort of a polymathic mind, and you have had experiences of consciousness that are counterintuitive, that are different than the average. Different than the average person's. Synesthesia, some agnosia, and things like that. And so you're working on your undergraduate degree, you're going along in life, and then you go to it. This is what I've heard from you. I don't know if I've got it right. You go to this conference, this mindSpace conference, and you
MindFest.
You get an idea. I'm going to start an organization and start inviting people to events
Yeah.
and change
Yeah.
the world. And then you do it.
Yeah.
Is that how it happened?
Yeah. No, I had so the full story of that is I was thinking about this stuff for a while, at least a year or
Mhm.
so beforehand. And it actually originally came out of things in like the medical side because I was interested in like, you'll hear stories about researcher A and researcher B. They're saying different countries. They're working on the same mechanism of cancer or whatever it is. And then, they don't realize that they've been doing the same thing until they meet at a conference 10 years later, type of thing.
Mhm.
And it's like, imagine if they knew about each other beforehand, right? How that could have potentially sped things up and made things more efficiently. So I was already thinking about ways of functionally connecting people together. And I was looking at, the things that I was interested in, my skill set. And, I think frankly, my interests were a little more on the eccentric and esoteric side to just kind of go out and do that. And then, I was already putting like this polymath thing was already in motion. Like I think I already had the event page and whatever. And I came to Mindfest, right? And that was the thing that like actually made me feel confident in it happening. And
So
to
you
be
thought, I
completely
can
honest,
do this. I can do
yeah,
this.
totally, right? Um, Before Mindfest, I figured I would be able to pull it off, but I did not have a specific idea of what it would look like. After Mindfest, I'm like, oh no, this is actually possible, right? And it's this thing where,
So did you have a feeling like, who am I to think that I could do something like
yeah,
this? I'm only X
yeah,
number of years old and I've only got
yeah,
a Bachelor of Science, and why would anybody
yeah,
listen to me? Did you go
yeah.
through that mental process?
I did, and I still do. And I will have my own existential crisis that I go through every other week about
Okay, I
who am
feel
I to
better
be.
then. I feel better then because I'm 76 and I still go through
Yeah.
that. I think, who am I
Wow.
to
All
think
right. You
anybody
you
would
look
want to
quite
talk
good
to
for
me?
76. Yeah.
Why would anybody want to talk to me? I'm just a nobody from nowhere.
Yeah.
I have this idea, and here's where my next question comes
Yeah.
from. I believe there's a reason that all these things connect. I
Yeah.
believe there's a reason that music and
Yeah.
philosophy and mathematics and computer science and all these things
Yeah.
connect. Why do you think they connect?
That is a very loaded question,
Sure.
and I question if I am even at the slightest bit certified to comment on that, but I'm gonna take a shot at it. My perspective and under my whole theory and way of looking at things, right, is that these fields come from differences in perspectives, right? So perspectives, in a sense, and maybe this is how we branch into the language perception synesthesia thing, but in a sense, when you're taking a perspective or a lens of viewing the world, it is technically a limitation. By saying you're seeing something, you're also negating something else, right? That's how we differentiate things and we see things, right, and experience things. And so I think it's not that we're necessarily creating these underlying connections between these fields. I think it's this sort of process of discovering, and it's
Mm-hmm.
it's already technically there. It's bound to what the observer is doing with it, right? And actually, I guess maybe I can bring this into an interesting way that I start a lot of my presentations on this whole information and ambiguity thing. Is I'll give this sort of example of, let's say you have a branch on a tree, right? Then you have the branch on the ground, the branch in your hand, the branch in a pit of fire. The branch is technically the same, but it's changing context because you're viewing it under a different lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first person to create a tool didn't have the idea of a Black and Decker hammer or whatever, right? It was a sort of vague idea, this kind of vague generalization of something, almost an intuition. And then by viewing the world through that lens and that goal, they were able to shape things around them, right? So in a lot of ways, this is, I've gotten better at it now, but when I was growing up, I'd be like, okay, this happens to be a spoon. This happens to be a fork, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I didn't, for whatever reason, if I didn't have a spoon or fork or a plate around me, I would use something else as a replacement for that, even
Mm-hmm.
though it wasn't physically identical, right? And I think that is the essence of this creative process, which is basically switching context. All right, so to go back to your question, I think they're all connected by default, and the differentiation and the separation comes from our own perspectives, right? Um, and so I think that's why like when I talk about I'm trying to think of a good example of this. when I talk about language, we'll use language as an example, right? I can have, my hand or whatever in front of me. I can describe that in various different ways. I can use English to describe this in different ways, right? You can speak in metaphors and analogies. You can also say it in French or Spanish or Mandarin or Japanese or a click language or whatever, right? You can still describe that to some degree in these completely different formats of thinking. Likewise, you can also use smell as an analog to describe your hand, or sound. You can use all these different representations because they're representations, right?
Mm.
And so I think in a sense, the difference in the boundaries between these fields are, illusion is a strong word, a very weighted word, but I would say they're illusions brought on by how the observer is looking at something, right?
Well, but okay, but it sounds
Yeah.
as though you're saying, it sounds as though you are a realist and you're saying the hand is actually there. There's a there that all these other things are alluding to.
The hand the hand changes depending on how I want to use it, right? It's like the branch thing. So I wouldn't say, like, I can say, yeah, I'm using my hand as a hand, but what does it mean to have a hand and use a hand, right? An analogy I can give you, right, is do you know, like, the Necker cube, the optical illusion? That's also the logo of Ekkolapto.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Where
So
you sometimes it looks like it's inside and sometimes it looks like it's outside.
yeah, it looks like it's facing this way,
Mhm.
whatever, inside out or completely flat. So that was kind of, in a lot of ways, why I chose that logo, because of the ambiguity of that information, because there's degrees of freedom of ways you can look at that. You can look at the cube facing different ways and it could be, equally correct, right,
Mhm.
depending on the context, right? And so when I think of my
But
hand
there would
or the
be
stick,
no optical illusion if you didn't already have in your mind a cube
sure,
that gets confused by the optical illusion.
in a sense, right? So my hand, I say I have a hand. What does that mean to have the hand? What am I using it for? What are its constraints, right?
Mhm.
If I say a hand is used to, pick up, my watch or my laptop, like, okay, what else can the hand do? How well does that function generalize to other things, right? Our
Mhm.
hands weren't necessarily meant to build tools or play instruments, right? And we even see how our skeletal system and everything adapts to these different changes,
Mhm.
right? So I don't, saying that there's a there again, maybe it's a cop out to say that it's observer dependent, right? Like,
Well, the reason I brought that up is
yeah,
in the specific context of what you were
yeah,
talking about. You were
yeah,
saying that there are many different ways and avenues that you can use
yeah,
to describe
yes,
a hand.
yeah,
You could have been saying the same thing about the color yellow.
yes,
You could have been
yes,
saying the same thing about a blade of grass.
sure,
There are many,
yeah,
and Wolfram talks about this when he
yeah,
talks about slices of computational reducibility,
mm-hmm,
that the way that we see things is observer dependent. It depends
yeah,
on where the observer is within the system.
yeah,
But the observer is inside the system. You can't help
yes,
that. And the observer is observing something in the system. There's something there.
yes,
I mean, I'm trying to get over the hump of the people that
yeah.
say that everything is just an illusion.
No, I don't think everything is an illusion. I
Okay,
think,
okay, then we can keep moving.
yeah, I wouldn't, I'm trying to figure out the right language, pun intended, on how to describe this, because maybe I don't fully understand it. It's very, very possible. My take on this has been that there is something happening. Like, and this is also comes from this idea that, oh, everything is illusion. Everything is an illusion. Nothing's real. Things are real. You go and stand in front of a car on a highway, like, you're not going to like the outcome of that, right? Um, or if you touch a hot stove, type of thing. It's
Mhm.
not that it's not real. It's that you're not seeing the thing in its entirety,
Yes, absolutely,
right?
absolutely, because
Yeah, that
it's
would maybe be a
computationally,
better way.
because the potential categories for that thing is computationally irreducible.
Yeah,
Yeah, no
yeah,
question. Yeah,
sure.
I'm
I
with you
can,
there. Yeah,
yeah. Um, and
and
so,
that's why context is so important.
yeah, yeah. I actually, I have a joke for context. I've actually done several of these information ambiguity presentations across Florida and in Boston, and I was always too shy to record them. So maybe
Mhm.
now I've started putting myself out there more, and I'll actually record them. Maybe someone has it on their phone or laptop somewhere. But one of the jokes I made, and this is something that's going to hit more after the thing just happened. But there was a Tom Brady Comedy Central roast. I think this was last year, right? And there was a joke. I made this joke. I said, "Listen, you are taking all these people, right? You're putting them in this room of concrete, of stone and metal and fossils, basically restructured fossils, whatever, and dirt and whatever. And you're putting them in this thing with all these lights and these shapes and whatever everywhere. And you're dressing them up a certain way. And all of a sudden, it becomes okay to insult every aspect of this guy and his wife and his kids and himself or whatever, right?" And I said, if you weren't in that room for the roast and you were at his house or some other occasion, he would deflate your balls. That was the joke that I made, right? Because it's hilarious, right? That we can that in that context, that social context, that fabric of being in that place, right? This sort of cognitive thing, that it's entirely okay to say this stuff. And matter of fact, if you go to a comedy show or something, people want to be right up in the front so that they can get roasted. And all of a sudden, it becomes almost entirely okay to say these super hurtful and personal things about people, right? If I were to say something like that to you right now, it would be horrible. But if we're, at a comedy roast, it's totally acceptable, right? So I just think it's very interesting. And I think this part of the reason that I kind of noticed this, earlier on in my life is because of that agnosia thing or whatever, where my context would be constantly switching. So it was very hard for me to function for a while. And I had to build up a lot of things to just make sense of the world and get by. And, it is kind of interesting that, it's sort of like you don't talk to your parents the same way that you talk to your friends. Or as Eminem would say in his Slim Shady days, it's like, I only give you things you joke about with your friends inside your living room, right? And it's like, part of the comedic appeal of a Slim Shady character was that he's taking things that people are saying in private and blasting it out in public, right?
Mhm.
And also like the appeal to that to an M character as well. I had a ramble session with my professor about this the other day. Is that Eminem in an interview is actually pretty tame. Like he doesn't, he's not dressed like a Marilyn Manson character or something, but even the Marilyn Manson kind of shtick worked back in the 2000s because, he dresses sort of very, very differently, but then he talks like in a completely chill and normal voice. He's way less hyper than me. He's more focused than me, and he comes across as completely normal. Right? So Slim Shady and Eminem, they're going and saying these absolutely insane things in their songs, but then on an interview or in person, the guy is like pretty normal most of the time. So that juxtaposition was really interesting, right? And I think the thing about that is this goes back into that idea of difference and sameness and agreement, right? So, the context of the roast only works if there's an agreement and there's something familiar, right? Because if you didn't have that shared context and agreement, you'd be totally offended and deflate the balls, right? And then also this idea of, a Manson or an Eminem type character, there was still something familiar and approachable to them, right? It's like there's some saying in the startup world, I think it's called Maya or something like Maya, and it's basically if you're doing something really out there and novel, you always want there to be something very familiar to grasp onto, right? So if you look at like the interface of like Mac OS in their early days and iOS in their early days, especially, they had used something called skeuomorphism, right? So the clock would look like a clock, what you'd have physically in front of you. The calculator would look like a calculator. The notes would look like a note, right? And then, as things changed and evolved, they started becoming more abstract with things. But also that's because now the context was stored in the culture, in all the people that were there living at the time using these devices to where, oh, we don't need to literally have this thing look like a notebook or a calendar or a clock anymore, right? We can get that abstraction, which is also how we create metaphors and analogies with language and we perceive the world, right? There was a song that Eminem had done a while back. I think this was maybe 2019 or 2020. It was called Darkness, right? And basically the whole song is like a double entendre between him as the performer and then the Vegas shooter. And it's only kind of revealed at the end.
Wow.
And personally, like he needs to do more of that. That song was incredible. like conceptually, that song was brilliant. I loved it. It's one of my favorite songs, and I think it's totally underrated by him. And then also, like, I grew up, listening to like Aesop Rock, Lupe Fiasco, LP. Lupe Fiasco I want to meet because he teaches at MIT now with his rap course and all of that. And I was so interested in the ambiguity of information, right? I told, I think, I don't know if it was Kurt or something, but I was saying, how interesting would it be if we just kind of like wrote kind of gibberish, like just a random collection of different words together. And if people were told, okay, this is a meaningful thing, they had that goal, that lens in mind, what would they take from it, right? And you can experiment with this by showing it to an artist or a musician or a biologist, a neurologist, or whoever, and see how they view that. It's kind of like when you're looking at somebody, at perspective on a problem, you usually ask somebody that's doing something slightly different from you to get out of that tunnel vision, right? And the thing, if you look at like a lot of like the lyrics of Aesop Rock or Bob Dylan or System of a Down or any of these people, like it doesn't make sense at face value. Like there's this famous thing in System of a Down where he says the kombucha mushroom people. I don't know what that means, right? At face value, you have to sort of think more abstractly and bridge those words together, right?
Well, I mean, it gives you a meta picture of,
yeah.
I mean, it gives me an instant picture of the kind of person he's talking about. But
yeah.
you have to have a lot of background.
Yes.
In kombucha, you have to have a lot of background in mushroom in order to get the combination between the two. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I also
what that really comes down to is how perception works.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, looking at affordances and just looking at the way that we categorize and how perception is so much based on the categories between the multiplicity and the unity. That you have to already have in mind what you're looking at before you can actually see it. I mean, this happens to me quite frequently. There's one building that I've been in several times, and every time I'm in that building, as I'm walking past, I'll see this picture that on first glance is an abstract.
Yeah.
It's just an abstract work with 2 or 3 different colors. Gray and gold and white or something. And then as I get a little bit further past it, I look again and oh my goodness, that's a photograph of a lion. It's a photograph of a lion cub coming through some weeds or something.
Yeah.
And it's happened to me several times that I don't see the lion until I'm right there. And I think that's the way perception works, that we have to get that shift, almost like this deja vu moment where our memories come into place. Yeah, you probably do some stuff with memory and time, right?
Yes. I have some interesting ideas about what memories are and how they function in regards to language and perception, right? Because memories, in a sense, are supposed to be the context, right? Mm-hmm. So, something that would also, so I think these things that I'm saying happen to me are just happen in more extreme states than, say, normal people, right? Normally functional people, where people have this, maybe I just had it to a more extreme degree. But, people will get lost in the moment. They'll forget where they were, what they're doing, right? And if they lose that memory, which is almost sort of structuring their sense of self in that moment, they forget where they are. But that also does make them more suggestible. Maybe they're more easily able to change and rework themselves, right? I gave this, I also, I think very good interviews, maybe such as yourself or Kurt, for instance. I said that he's a method actor because one of the things that he would do, right, is he would really try to get in the shoes of the people he's interviewing to literally, can he experience their theory as they do? Mm-hmm. And that takes a level of plasticity and suggestibility that not everybody sort of naturally has or has access to kind of, directly reach into. And, it's sort of a double-edged sword because if you're very suggestible and open, there is that kind of saying about, if your mind is too open, don't let it fall out. But there is this thing where it's like, you don't want to be too suggestible and plastic because then what are you? If you're always changing, what are you? Right. And it's like this idea about like, if you could be anything, then what are you? If something is always changing. So something that happened to me a lot. And the reason I'm, we can change subject if you want, but the reason I'm talking about this thing a lot that I was going through when I was younger is I'm wondering how many other people have had this similar experience and what we can kind of learn from each other, right? Because what I've also kind of found is that a lot of people with very interesting ideas usually had some, from pretty early age, very different way of looking at the world, right? Perspective, their lens of reality, their way they're seeing things, right? And so what would happen is, if someone was moving from room to room, or this object was moving here, my way of inducing permanence wasn't very good, right? And so I'd constantly see things as changing, but then I realized, wait, in order to see the thing change, I have to be seeing something in common. There's a difference in sameness, right? Which is a big thing that I touch on, and also plenty of philosophers and people out there. And I got better at drawing the continuity between things that were changing, right? And it's as simple as like your body is always changing, right? I'm physically, I'm not necessarily the same person I was, a year ago or even a month ago, right? We say that there's atoms or molecules or whatever in our body. I could say, oh, there's this hydrogen in my body. They're not physically the same hydrogen, as far as I know, between me and you, even though we both have hydrogen. That's a category. That's a sameness, right? It's amongst that difference in the way that we're differentiating things. And one of the earliest thought experiments that I did that really helped me operate in the world a little bit better was, I used to think of, all right, what is sort of the simplest thing that I could think of in terms of like perception, measurement, observation, right? I was like, oh, like a black and white square or something. And I realized I could only know the black from the white and the white from the black. But in order to tell those things apart, you had to be talking about the same thing. This is that thing you were talking about earlier, about having that idea in place, right? And so in that case, that would be, the category of luminance, right? Of black and white, right? There's something shared that lets you actually see those things together and differentiate them in the first place, right? And then I realized, when you would learn a language, or when you, see things around you, your perception is in a sense a language, because when when you're perceiving the world for the first time, before you've built all these things of permanence around you, you're constantly trying to stitch in continuity and patterns between things. And, when we see how people react to things like optical and auditory illusions, we see those edge cases of what happens. So I think those edge cases are quite representative of what happens to us when we come into the world and we're learning these things for the first time. And that led...
I'm going to put a pin there and finish your sentence, and then we'll come back. I want to touch on that.
I was going to go into the olfactory thing, so we can go to...
okay. So you were just talking about when we come into the world and we're looking at things for the first time, and the way that kind of alters our perspective. I mean, how we develop our perspective.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about this for a long, long, long time, because I was in graduate school. My graduate degree was in linguistics. And so, of course, there you're looking at the whole language box, the language center, which is really built into people. You're built with a black box that can manage language, So actually, you can grow up in a bilingual or trilingual household with all these different languages coming at you. And as an infant, your infant brain will categorize those three languages and all the grammars and all the vocabulary. And when you begin speaking, you'll speak one language or another language or another.
Yeah.
So you have this black box. So there's some sort of I've never known a right word to use for this, but there's some sort of a matrix or some sort of a scaffold that has little Velcro things on it. So when a piece of information that you need comes along, it's fuzzy and it sticks to that little Velcro in your little box. And then that's how you gather data and categorize things. And it's not just
expand on the fuzziness thing. Expand on the fuzziness thing, if you don't mind.
Well, not like fuzzy language. Probably fuzzy logic. I used the wrong word.
Yeah.
It's sticky. Things come to you and they're sticky, and they stick in various categories. So, as in language, you're picking up all this different vocabulary, and your little scaffold will absorb all the English words, and it will absorb all the Italian words in the right place. In the same way that children can recognize a cat, even though there are many, many, many different kinds of cats.
Yeah.
They're still going to say, oh, that black thing and that white thing and that black and white thing and the orange and yellow thing, those are
Yeah.
all cats, and they're going to recognize
Yeah.
that because they have a category maker in their
Hmm.
system. And memories work the same way. I mean, I'm just thinking about as you're growing, the way that
Yeah.
information comes at you and how you sort it and how you make sense of the world. Now, of course, there are people who have um, unique minds like yours. So for you, it's a little bit more complicated maybe to do
Yeah.
all those things, but it's,
Yeah.
it's still there. But the
Yeah.
reason I'm bringing that up is I want to go back to something you said earlier about Kurt and how
Yeah.
when he interviews people, he really sinks into their point of view so that he can, and he studies every theory in depth so that when he's talking to the person, he really understands where they're coming from. Um, I don't have Kurt's kind of a mind. I don't have his intellect, and I don't have his educational background. Um, so what I do instead is that I have a scaffold that is the way that I perceive the world through this lens of the design principles in art. And when I'm listening to people, whether they're talking physics or biology or computer
Yeah.
science, or whatever, I can understand what they're saying, even though I don't have an educational background in what they're talking
Yeah.
about. I can understand it because it's going through this filter in my brain of
Yeah.
design principles in art,
Right.
which is why I think there is some connection between all these
Yeah.
things. I can translate
Right.
basically through that. And I think we all do that to some extent. We have some sort of a framework that we use
Mhm.
to translate things. So you grew up in a certain way. And so when you hear me talking, you understand the words that I'm saying through the filter that's in your brain. And then
Yep.
you might be, maybe you're only getting 20% of what I actually
Yep.
mean. And unless we hammered it out and had a theolocution and
Yeah.
really worked out what all the different words mean, but you're getting a general sense of what I'm saying.
Yes.
Then when you start talking, the words coming out of you are coming through your filter,
Right.
and um, and they might mean something different to you than they even mean to in the dictionary, and
Yeah.
they're certainly going to mean something different to me. So I've always found it quite a miracle that any of us can communicate with each other at all,
Yeah.
because our own personal experiences invest the language with completely unique perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that actually you put that very well, probably better than I could have. Um, and I think actually, so the cool thing about that, right, is that you can take a different understanding, but you can still make use of the information, right? Which goes to that sort of idea of the language thing. But yeah, I could describe the computer in different language, but I could still use it in somewhat of a similar way, right? Like people, who know Russian or Chinese aren't going to use the computer entirely differently, but they will use it in slightly different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's also what gives us sort of that differentiation and that diversity, right? And the interesting thing that like I've got to wonder, like, and this is sort of a question for you, right? Is like how much of what you do on the channel, on the meeting code, like the things that you're learning from there, like directly experientially transfer over to things outside of the channel. Now, I'm sure you kind of live and breathe this stuff to a degree, as we all kind of tend to do. But have you noticed it in just some really far areas where there was like far transfer between something you learned on the channel or in your, prep for an interview, and then to something completely different?
Well, let me clarify the question. Are you asking, are there practical applications to what I'm learning, or are you asking something different?
I'm saying, you know, are there things that you've learned on the channel, right? Whether it's of things, things that you can store in a textbook or more experiential ways of looking at the world or thinking about problems that have transferred over to something that you wouldn't have expected they would have transferred over to. Like maybe learning something about physics gave you a really interesting idea, perspective into art or music or something like that.
That's a really good question. I'd have to think about that more. My first response is probably way too honest.
Yeah.
My first response is that I think in many ways I'm pretty close-minded about things
Really.
because I have this um, uh, I'm not trying to sound arrogant, but I have a very deep understanding of the principles and of the design elements of art. And
Yeah.
so that deep
I
understanding,
can tell by your background.
that deep, well, not that I can execute on it. I'm
Yeah.
just saying the understanding is there. And for decades I've thought about how those design principles show up in all these different domains of knowledge. And
Yeah.
so when I hear a physicist talking and I'm learning something new from them about physics, it's automatically going into my
Yeah.
database that's built on this theory that I live out of the design principles and the elements and principles of art. And that because I believe that is kind of lying underneath everything in the world. It's
Yeah.
underneath all the particles. Um, in fact, you know how hard it is to use language to explain anything because you
Sure.
struggle with that yourself, right? And the
Yep.
other day I was trying to put it into one sentence, and the sentence I came up with is that my idea is that the matrix or scaffold afforded by the combinatorially explosive number of potential intersections of the principles and elements of design can also be considered to be the boundary of relationality. You can go this far and no farther. And that this would seem to fit well with what Fields is talking about in his new paper about objects and processes inhabiting
Yeah.
the space. So because that's the way I see the world,
Yeah.
everything I hear goes through that before I can stop
Right.
and think, have I learned something new? Yes, I've learned lots of new things about physics and about perspectives on the world. And like the many conversations that I had with Wolfgang Smith, um, I learned a new way of looking at things that I would not have thought about otherwise from his perspective. Um, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that he says, but there's some things that he said that gave me a new lens to understand things.
Sure.
So, um, yeah, so I mean, I've had experiences like that where I've talked with somebody and it kind of gave me then I can I can think when I'm learning something else new, I'll go, oh, well, from Wolfgang's perspective, it would be this, or from
Yeah.
Wolfram's perspective, it would be this, you know.
Sure.
But at the bottom, for me, it's always going through that other lens.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
No, that does. And I will definitely catch myself at times where I may get a little too rigid with my lens and worldview of things, right? The way I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at it. And then sometimes I have to sort of not hyperfixate on it, get out of that tunnel vision and be
Yeah.
like, okay, now I kind of see what they're talking about, right? And it is this sort of thing where you want there to be, you know how people talk about like spaced repetition and stuff like that?
Spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition, yeah, for like learning, and how there's gaps in your attention and memories. It's a
Mm-hmm.
space.
Yes.
So there,
Okay.
people will say, if you want to learn a task, or learn something, it's good to do it, spaced repetitively, right?
Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah.
And the thing that I find interesting for getting perspective and understanding, hopefully understanding what people are saying at a deeper level, is you is these breaks in hyperfixation. Like you want to hear on what they're saying, and then sometimes you distract yourself for a little bit, and then come
Mm-hmm.
back to it, and then it starts to click a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a suspicion that this is sort of like what sleeping and dreaming does, which I've spoken about on video before, about how they basically keep your mind from over specializing and hyper fixating on something, right? It's getting rid of
Mm-hmm.
that tunnel vision by introducing that kind of noise and distraction.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about this with friends many times, one of whom is a physics, a PhD physics student. And, we'll talk about how we'll get tunnel vision or whatever, and how just looking elsewhere, sort of not directly paying attention to
Mm-hmm.
something, often does the trick, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll actually,
Okay, hold on to that because I have two
yeah,
great stories related to that.
go for it.
One is years ago, I was at a 6-week training course in how to learn a language where there is no written language. There's no written language, and there's no grammar or syntax developed for that language. How do you go
Uh-huh.
into a tribe and learn that language from scratch?
Right.
And one of the guys told this story about how when he first went up into the hill country of Vietnam, he was learning one of the kind of rare languages that exist up in the hill country in Vietnam, and trying to really absorb it. And he'd been there for like a year, and he hadn't made headway at all. He couldn't grasp what they were talking. He couldn't find the object subject combo. He couldn't determine any syntax regarding action or anything. He's completely flummoxed by it, but he had been completely absorbed, hyperfixated for a year. And then he went on a vacation with his family for 6 weeks. And when he came back and people started talking to him, instantly he understood what they were saying. He just needed that. He needed the distance.
Yeah.
He had put in the time, the effort, the focus, and everything else, but he needed the distance and the noise of another world to clear out the cobwebs and get him to be able to understand again. Now, the second story is there's a artist by the name of Kate Worms who does these beautiful colors.
What's the name?
Kate Worms, Worms. She does these beautiful figurative works. The colors are just extraordinary. I don't know if you can find it online or not.
Kate Worm. I see this here.
Kate.
Kate.
Yeah, Worms, Worms.
Kate.
Uh-huh.
Kate Worms.
Yeah, I don't know if you'll find her, but the point is the way that she comes up with the colors that she uses is that she doesn't look at the object. She doesn't look at the person she's trying to paint or at their clothing or anything else. She looks to the side, and she lets herself see that person through her peripheral vision. And she paints completely from her peripheral vision. So she might be looking at a golden color, but what will be in her peripheral vision is some kind of a lavender. And she will paint what she sees in her peripheral vision. And it just makes for beautiful work. So anyway, I want to throw those two out there.
No, so I think I understand both of those, and I have my own stories of those and other people. So for the first one, this is not the first time I've heard of these things happening to people. And people will say, oh, it's just sort of this miraculous thing. It kind of came out of nowhere. But I think there is something probably predictable about it, right? And what I sort of think, right, is this is also why, in exercise, right, and biology and biohacking, whatever, you don't want to overtrain, right? Overtraining is like over specializing and overfitting in a sense. I think there's some researcher that uses overfitting to describe dreams. I think the name is slipping me. I think he's in the UK, but if you overfit, you overtrain, you overspecialize, you don't get the same scope and breadth of the skill that you do, right? Part of the reason that the skill gains its robustness and its reliability is because it generalizes to all these different contexts, right? Right. That's, it's like how we talk about in psychology and cognitive science about a general intelligence or a far transfer, right? You don't want something that's just only for this thing. You want that to have a level of robustness that transfers between different tasks, right? And so, if you train under very, very specific settings constantly, right, it's not the skills and the skills not going to have the same amount of strength, in my opinion. And it reminds me of,
well, that's why what you're doing is so important. That's exactly why what you're doing is so important.
Yes. And then on the second one, I'll try to go on this quickly. Not exactly the same thing as Kate does, but one of the things
while you're talking, I'm going to put it up on the screen.
Perfect. One of the things I've been interested in for a while. So I'm very obsessed with blurriness for some reason.
Obsessed with what?
Blurriness.
Oh, blurriness.
Just blurriness and ambiguity in general. I love images and videos with a lot of diffusion and haze. I like things that are blurry and out of focus. Like, I would be completely happy watching an entire video or entire movie that's just bokeh and blur. Could be a Gaussian blur, bokeh, whatever. I would be totally happy doing that. For some reason, I'm so drawn to blur. And one of the things that I would like to experiment with right early on is I would try to see what would other images or things look like when you blurred them, and then try to repaint or draw over them, right? So something like you can do in Photoshop is, let's say I can take what I'll actually use sometimes to make like custom fonts and stuff is I'll
Hmm.
take an existing font, I will blur that, and then there's the curve thing where you can move the highlights and the whites and the blacks so it crushes it, and
Yes,
then
yes,
now
yes.
it's got this new shape. So
Yes.
I would do this all the time
I
on
used I used to
fonts
years ago.
and
I used to use that in
yeah,
developing my my work and
yeah,
developing my compositions. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so I'm really interested in how that what that kind of means for the way that we design concepts and principles and all that. And then also now you get something interesting where you can take an existing image and let's say you reinterpret it using, what is it, like the AI stable diffusion things, and it'll come up with this new image. And you can keep filtering this over and over and over and get these new things. I
Hmm.
actually did find an artist online. I'll have to find the name to give it to people. But if I remember correctly, what the person does is he has some existing image and then he blurs it and runs it through some stable diffusion model or something, and you're constantly reinterpreting the image, right?
Well, what I used to do is if I would paint something and I wasn't
Yeah,
happy with it, like if I paint a portrait and I wasn't
yeah,
happy with the way it turned out, I would turn it upside down and then I would look at it and I would think, okay, how can I reinterpret this
yep,
image? And now you're not looking at a blank page. You're looking at something that's already there, that's jumbled, and you have to fight against it, sort of. It's like an opponent processing thing.
yeah,
And then kind of superimpose on top of that the image that you're thinking about, and then start battling against the background.
right,
Or another way that I work is to create a lot of chaos on the canvas, just throw a lot of color
yep,
and blur it out and everything else, and then just ponder it. What's there? How do I find my subject in the middle of that chaos? And
love it.
and I started doing this like, I don't know, 25 years ago, and writing about how it was a process of finding order out of chaos, which is why when I ran into
Yeah,
Jordan Peterson, I'm like,
yeah,
oh
yeah,
my goodness, here is my
yeah,
soul brother.
yeah. There you go. Yeah, yeah. I think you had his. I think I saw was Tammy. Is that his wife or something? I
Yes,
believe.
yeah,
I think I saw.
she
She
was
might have.
on the channel one time. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but this is. By the way, I'm in complete agreement about what you're saying about all the art stuff. At least the way that I'm understanding it, right? And something that's kind of interesting to me. Um, your example about the flipping it reminded me of the thing people would say about draw what you see, not what you think. Right. So,
Mhm.
in art class or depending where you went, people would say, all right, if you're trying to draw a face or something, flip it over so you don't recognize it. You're changing the
Mhm.
context and then you're drawing it in this different way. Right.
Yeah.
Then oftentimes you flip it over and like, oh, this actually turns, looks better.
Mhm.
Right. Um, and I think artists in general, right. And maybe the field selects more for it than other fields generally. But there is that ability of disconnecting context that I think artists just have a better time doing because that's kind of like a demand of the job. Right? When you're creating instrumentals or songs or lyrics, people will have sort of a formula or a pattern. But the people that are really trying to push that edge and that boundary, they're saying, okay, I just did this thing. Now I'm going to go and do something else. Right? One of my favorite examples of this, um, again, this is my Gen Z showing, but Linkin Park, right? So Linkin Park, they had their Hybrid Theory album in like 2000, right? That was sort of more traditional new metal. Then they shifted it a little bit with Meteor. They went in a somewhat different direction with Minutes to Midnight. And then in 2010, it was a couple year break that they took. They did A Thousand Suns, which was like a completely different rock record, right? And then Mike Shinoda, who was the front man and or I guess the one of the he was the main guy behind Linkin Park, right? He also did a project on the side called Fort Minor, and they have this album called The Rising Tide, which is one of my favorite albums ever. The lyrics are pretty good, the production is solid, and he's showing you that range that he has of constantly getting himself to do something different, right? Famously, people would get upset with Linkin Park because they kept changing their sound. And you know what? I like the Hybrid Theory sound more. I do like the new metal electron. I think I do like that more. But they came out with an album in 2017. It's called One More Light, which was also the time Chester Bennington had passed away and all that, right? It was the last album with the original Linkin Park group. And that was sort of a pop album. Like it was a pretty poppy album, right? And a lot of people got upset because they had this expectation that Linkin Park was rock. but I was like, oh wow, they're exploring pop. That's kind of cool. What's their take on it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I also found out, like, so a while back I found out Lupe Fiasco, who is a very, very skilled lyricist and rapper, it was a band called Japanese Cartoon. It was like a rock band almost. I was like, okay, this is what would happen if Lupe Fiasco took his tool set, his lens of looking at the world, and did that under rock, right? And I also found out, I think David Chalmers had like a rock band or something at one point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I forget, I don't
Fascinating.
remember the name of it, but I found out about that. Yeah. Um, but anyways, my point about bringing that up is this idea of shifting those perspectives, those
Mm-hmm.
lenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like how you're saying about flipping the drawing or whatever. It's so interesting when you technically have the same thing in front of you, but you're changing your perspective and how different that looks. And sort of tying that back directly to the art thing. Um, Artists, I think, do because they have to constantly change things, right? When you're a scientist, a lot of the time you're trying to find a formula or a pattern, right? I think a lot of the time with art is you're trying to not find that pattern. You're trying to find
Well,
sort of a meta
it's like
pattern.
everything else. It depends, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a scientist, um, like Michael Levin,
Mm-hmm.
he's always asking the question, what if?
Yeah.
That's what makes him different.
Yes.
Now, what happens sometimes to artists, and maybe this is just my excuse, I don't know,
Yeah.
um, that anytime I would think about trying to get into a gallery so that I would
Yeah.
have a steady income stream, the gallery says we need to have a certain look so that
Sure.
when people see this work, they're going to say, oh, that's a Karen Wong. And then if one of them sells on the wall, I can bring in another one and hang it up, and people will still be able to know that's a Karen Wong. Okay, I don't ever work that way because every time I finish one painting, I say, well, but what if I did this?
Yeah.
What if I did that? Or, what if? And so if you walk, I used to do a studio annually in my house where we'd empty the whole house of furniture and then hang up all the art. And 400 people would come through on a weekend and see all the art. But it's like walking through a gallery of many, many different artists because all my work
Yeah.
was different. I'd never had all the same thing. So it's exciting to me to hear that these young musicians are working that way, where
Yeah.
they're not just trying to get a sound. Like, the Beach Boys had a sound.
Yeah.
It was the same sound all, for years. Um, the Beatles were different. They kind of broke that mold because
Sure.
they were able to say what if, and they started shifting
Yeah.
their sound. But some artists, I think, um, and they tend to be the ones that are remembered a long time are the ones that had their own particular sound or their own particular
Yes.
look. But it can also be a trap. Like
Yeah.
Thomas Kincaid got into a trap, and then
Mm-hmm.
although he was a gifted artist, all of his work
Yeah.
looked the same forever. And
Yeah.
occasionally he would break out and do something like a simple natural landscape, and they were just
Right.
beautiful. But most of the time, he was producing work that would look the same as all his other work. So,
Right.
um, yeah, I do think that the what if question, Einstein asked the what if question.
Yep.
There were other scientists that just kept building on everything that had been done before and wouldn't break the mold. So,
Sure. I'm gonna follow that up with a question for you. Have you heard of the band Tool by chance?
Ben,
Tool. Tool. The band Tool.
the band, no, I
Yeah.
don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know
It's
all
so
these.
they came out of like the 90s, right? But there's this guy behind it, is Maynard James Keenan, right? And so he has three different bands actually. He has Tool, he has Pussifer, and then a Perfect Circle. And they're all slightly different, right? And I think him being sort of the sort of guide behind those bands in a way, it was better for the audience, I think, that he had a different name and category for each of the different boundaries he was going towards, right?
Mhm.
If you put a Pussifer song or a Perfect Circle song in a Tool album, people probably wouldn't like it in the same way. So
Yeah.
I think maybe something I would ask you, right, is do you think, let's say a singular artist, Karen, right? Let's just say you wanted to explore some things widely different and people weren't really ready for that or able to kind of jive with that well. Would it be more advantageous to release it under a different name? That way, like the main Karen thing kind of stays and there's something else. It's still you. You're still the artist, but you're using different voices and tools, and maybe people for whatever reason have an easier job coming to grips with that. Do you get what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there certainly were authors that did that in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
They'd have a whole oeuvre of work that they had under their given name, and then they would have a
Yeah.
nom de plume somewhere along the line that they would publish other work under. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, I just decided after I'd been painting for maybe 10 years, up until that time, I had been entering a lot of art shows and everything, and I was
Yeah.
doing pretty well. I got a number of awards, and
Nice.
I was selling quite a bit of work. But what I found, and this may be my own emotional weakness, is that if I would enter a piece in a show, and then a lot of times, some of these shows, there might be 1,000 entries and 100 of
Yeah.
them are accepted. And it's not always accepted. What you have to learn after a while is that they're not always accepted based on whether or not these are the 100 best. These are
Sure.
the 100 that particular judge liked.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with the Nobel Prize and everything else, right? You have certain
Yeah.
judges, they have their own bias.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if I would enter a piece and then it would get rejected, that would deep six me for 6 weeks. I wouldn't be able to get back
Yeah.
to work because I would just think, well, maybe I am an imposter and maybe this is
Right.
all stupid. And why am I doing this? And nobody likes my work. So after a few years, I just decided, you know what? I'm just going to paint. I'm going to explore. I'm going to, have my adventure in painting. I'm not going to worry about entering anything. I'm not going to worry about pleasing anybody. I'll make my work available, and if people want to buy it, great. And I had a number of good years selling even after that. And then
Yeah.
COVID came along, and well, the financial crisis back in
Yeah.
the mid teens kind of put a deep six in people buying art, especially in the Bay Area, because
Right.
the Bay Area is not a big collector area.
Yeah.
And then, of course, COVID came along and I stopped doing shows. But for me, it was never about being able to sell it. It was, I have something I want to express. And if there's somebody else that has the same heart and they would like to
Yeah.
share that heart with me and see the work or buy it for their home, then that's great. But I gave up on trying to please anybody. So I never tried to be in a category. I was just exploring
Yeah.
ideas. And I was always exploring ideas around this idea of how the principles intersect with the elements. And
Yeah.
so my work was always, so what I do is I do a series of 20 pieces, all on the same theme and the same subject, but then there might
Yeah.
be 20 completely different styles of that theme
Right.
subject.
Are you happy with the way things have gone? You feel like, I mean, do you ever think about if you went the other way instead and continued what you were doing in the past?
Well, when you get older, that can be an endless road to go down.
Yeah.
When I
Yeah.
was 19 years old in college, I was at a bar in North Dakota, and Louis Shortino and his band came through, and they were playing at the bar. And Louis took a liking to me, and he had me come up and sing with them. And then he said, "Why don't you go on the road with us?" And so
Yeah.
when I was 19, I could have gone on the road with Louis Shortino and his band.
Yeah.
What if? Maybe I would have
Yeah.
become a famous singer. Who knows?
Yep.
You can't second guess your life like that. There's a
Yeah.
thousand times when it could have
I
gone
have that problem a lot.
Yeah. So I have very much enjoyed painting. I've very much enjoyed
Yeah.
I've been keenly aware of it recently because I've been cleaning out my art studio. Since I
Yeah.
started doing this channel, the only kind of work I'm doing anymore is commissions. If somebody commissions
Got it.
me to do something, I'll paint. Otherwise, all my time goes into the channel and into
Yeah.
exploring all these theories. But I was going through a lot of old work, and when I first started, I used to do all my work on paper,
Right.
like watercolor or acrylic on
Yeah.
paper. And art paper is quite expensive. Even
Yes.
back then, it was $5 to $10 a sheet. Now it's probably $10 to $20 a sheet for a piece of paper. And I'm going through, and a lot of them were what I would consider failed works that I had kept because maybe I'll paint over them or something. But I'm going through, I got to get rid of this stuff. So I'm just throwing stuff out right and left. And I'm thinking $10, $20. Oh my God, all this money I spent, what a waste. And then the thought hit me, well, I could never have done the work that I did later if I hadn't done
Yep.
that work. You have to put in a certain amount of brush mileage. You have to use a certain amount of resources in order to make any progress in anything.
Yep.
And it was cheaper than going to a movie.
Yeah.
I got a lot of entertainment out of it. So, and I learned the elements and principles to a very deep degree because I was executing on them every single day. And the thing about the elements and principles isn't that
Yeah.
it's something that you can execute. It's something that while you're painting, while you're in the
Yeah.
process,
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
things are arising in front of you and you can't ignore them. That's just, it's the way the world is. And so it's always
Or
coming up in front of you. And so I learned them at a very deep level because of all that experience. So yeah, no, I have no regrets over the way things
yeah,
are.
I have two questions for that. One, so there's that sandbox lab that we have, and we're looking to kind
Mhm.
of redesign the space a little bit. So if you're interested, maybe we'll do a commission painting potentially. That would be kind of, yeah, I would. Do you ship?
Well, yeah, it would have to be something that if it's a canvas work, I would
Yeah,
have to ship it rolled up and you'd have to get it
got it.
put on
Got
the
it.
frame when it got
Okay.
there. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll take you up.
I could, and probably, or the other way that I can do it, if it's a large one, like I just recently did a commission that was 60 by 80,
Yeah,
and I did it on 4 canvases. So
right,
4 canvases that are 30 by 40, but then they fit together as 80
right.
wide and 60
Yeah,
high.
yeah,
And that way
yeah,
it's very shippable because you just stack the four
yeah.
canvases, put it in a box and ship
That's
it
a
off.
smart way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would either be a one single one or maybe multiple ones that we put throughout the room. We're still figuring out how to do that, but I'll take you up on that. And then the second
Yeah.
thing would be um, your mental state and lens or whatever word we're using when you go in and you think about these things and actually create the thing right between that process. Because there's something I've that kind of really hit me in a certain way, right? Like you don't. I felt like I never understood a Nirvana song or Juice. You may not know who Juice World was, but he was a pretty famous artist for a while. He was like, I think he was 20 when he passed away or something. But Juice World or Nirvana or any song that's just a little more sad or depressive, right? Or like Deftones or even to a degree Stairway to Heaven, right? Um, it never hit me in the same way until after I got very depressed.
Hmm.
Right, there was a certain level where I'm gonna make an assumption that when Kurt was writing, not Kurt Mungle, the other, Kurt Cobain, was
Mhm.
writing, his songs or whatever, or Radiohead, especially actually. You probably know Radiohead, yeah. And, generally any song from Radiohead, which are usually a little more sad, right?
Mhm.
Um, is that it hit very differently after I'd gone through really, really bad depression and during that depression.
Mhm.
And even certain Eminem songs, like say the song "Beautiful" off of Relapse, like the songs just hit differently because I think you're sharing potentially sharing more of that lens or that lens that you're going through at that moment is maybe easier able to interpret that information. And the other thing that happens is if you do that enough, you listen to the song and then you can start to induce that state because of how strong that association is, right?
Mhm.
And you've almost got to be a little careful with that because of how strong the association can be at times. But my question for you, right, is are there certain things, whether it's if you're stressed, you're sleepy, you're feeling very happy or ecstatic, or maybe a little more depressed or sad, like do you sort of have a more formalized way of that of how that affects the way that you paint or draw or think about things?
Well, I can see it in the work
Yeah,
after the work is done.
yeah,
Um, One of the things that professional artists always talk about, and I mean, I'm not putting myself in the category of a professional artist, but is that you have to be consistent and work every day
yeah,
as much as possible. Now, I'm also a housewife and a mom, and so I haven't
sure.
always been able to be in the studio every day. But when I was working towards a show or something like that, I would do my very best to paint every day. And
Yeah,
when I'm working on a commission, I do that. So you have on days and off days, but
yeah,
you just keep working because you never know what's going to show up. You just have to
Yeah.
be consistent and keep working. Um, I have done pieces when I was in a very traumatic, kind of a traumatized internal state because of things that were going on in my life, and they really show it. Um,
Yeah.
but they make a deep emotional connection with other people, and people buy them because it meets them at wherever they're at, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have had other paintings that I painted when I was in more of an ecstatic mode, and you
Right.
can see it. And then I
Yeah.
have other paintings that maybe are more abstract or conceptual,
Sure.
or kind of up in the head, and you can see that. So yeah, you can see it in the work. It isn't something that I can impose on a work. I can't go,
Yeah.
oh, I'm feeling sad, I think I'll go paint a sad painting. I mean, it
Right.
doesn't work that way. It's more like I'm going to paint regardless of how I feel, and then we'll see what shows up. Because a lot of times I might be aiming for a particular result. Maybe I want to paint a certain figure that has a certain gesture that I'm hoping will explore
Right.
some aspect of the meaning of life or something.
Sure. Yeah.
But after the painting is finished, I look at it and I think, oh, there's something there that I wasn't aiming for, but it shows up very clearly. So there must have been something inside my own emotional or psychic process that I wasn't aware of when I was painting that shows up in the final work. And that's a very interesting thing to see, because you learn about yourself when you look at your own work. You learn about your failures, your shortcomings. You learn about what you need to work on in order to get further able to do the things that you want to do in the future. And that's what always keeps you pressing forward. But you also learn where your strengths are that you may not have been aware of. And you also learn what
Yeah.
your thought process is.
So I imagine then it's a similar thing for, let's say you have a painting. I know you sort of mentioned it earlier a little bit, but let's say you paint something today, and then you look at it 10 years later or whatever. Like, do you feel like when you look at your past work, or even things that are just even 2 weeks ago type of things, right? Do you feel like sometimes you do come away with a different interpretation and meaning of it, right? Because it is kind of contextual.
Well, we talked a little bit before we came online about
Yeah.
how Tomer Solomon was at
Yeah.
my house a few weeks back, and
Yeah.
because I'm getting rid of a lot of art, I just gave him a handful of art to take with him. And as he and I were going through the work in these old drawers, there were these two portraits that I had completely forgotten doing,
Yeah.
of women from, I believe it was an African nation.
Mm-hmm.
Our church has a kind of a world market store that they do once a year, selling items made by women from this African nation in order to give them a venue to sell their work, and then be able to send them the income from it so that they can continue to make things. And
Right.
they were going to have an art show as a promotion for the world market. So they gave out a bunch of us photographs of some of these women, and they said, can you paint portraits of them? So I had painted these two portraits of these women from this African nation. I'd completely forgotten about it, and dragged them up out of the drawer when I was there with Tomer
Yeah.
Solomon.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm looking at him like, oh my gosh, these were really good. At the
Yeah.
time, I'm sure I stuck them in the drawer because I thought, oh, well,
Yeah.
it's good enough. But I dragged him up out of the drawer, and I'm like, oh, there's something there that I hadn't even seen
Yep.
before. The depth of feeling in these people, and the way that the color and the contrast and everything was used made them
Yeah.
very dramatic, that I
Yeah.
wasn't aware of at the time, because all I was worried about then was my skill.
Sure.
Maybe the proportions
Yeah. Yeah.
off by 2% or something, and I'm really worried about that.
Yeah. Actually, that fixation thing brings up an interesting point about. I know McGilchrist likes to talk about the left and right brain thing, right? About
Mhm.
the people, but that is an interesting thing where I think that to sort of be a very good curator of things, whether you're an artist or
Mhm.
DJ or whoever, right? there is that kind of that taste and that aesthetic, and that comes from more than the sum of just the parts, right? You're kind of looking at the whole of the thing. And I have realized, like, when I was, when I would be working on photos or videos or lyrics or songs or whatever, years ago, even like 10 years ago, right? And I would remember being very fixated on certain things. Like, for a while, I had a very strong fixation on a certain type of drum sound or a certain font or like a certain just a certain detail I would be really hyper focused on, right? And then now when I look at it all these years later, right, at that time I wasn't really feeling it and I just shoved it aside, right? And then now when I look, I'm like, oh no, like that was actually not bad. Like that, like you almost have to forget the position you were in when you made that and disconnect yourself from it, and then look at it again. You're like, oh, actually that actually wasn't too bad. That was pretty cool, right? And I think everyone probably does go through this. Artists, scientists, whoever. And I think that's a very interesting thing about, how we talk about the right time and place for things, like tying that into the event thing, right? About, I don't know if this polymath thing would have worked in the early 2000s or in the 90s, right? I don't know if this will work in 50 years. Maybe things will change. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And I also don't know, like, people talk about a product or something being too early for its time, right? And part of having that perfect thing is that you've just happened to match the culture and zeitgeist in a way that you can stimulate it without being so far off, right? And I think something like, the iPhone, right, could have very much gone down that road. And it did. Like, there were a lot of people that, there's the famous Steve Ballmer thing, but like, there was a lot of people, the way it was designed, the fact that there was no keyboard, all that type of stuff. Like, I don't think the original iPhone even had a copy and paste, right? I think that I remember that being the case. And that thing could have gone south very, very quickly. But I think it was the way, Apple has their reality distortion field, the way they affected the culture and the zeitgeist, the way they marketed it, in a lot of ways is what brought us to the position that we are today, right? I had a friend with someone in Cambridge who worked as a designer for a while, right? And I was telling him about this idea about how, marketing and branding is basically, that's giving you the lens to view the product or a thing, right? Like, I'll give you an example. I can go to Walmart right now, okay? And I can get a plain black tee or hoodie, okay? Okay, the material's okay, whatever, it's fine. Let's say I put a Louis Vuitton logo or a Balenciaga logo or whatever. All of a sudden, now people would pay so much more money for it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? The entire thing changes. Its actual function in the society changes just by that sort of, language, symbolic, whatever thing on it, right? And the funny thing is you don't even necessarily need to put the logo on there. Right, there's been so many cases where there's been like brands like Mischief and Balenciaga or whatever, where they will take products that are sort of looking like they're kind of, lower quality or whatever, and they'll just market it a certain way. And now all of a sudden it's this highly valued item, right? And I also think part of it, right, is that marketing and branding are the instructions of how you're supposed to view and experience the product, right? It's kind of like, the example just slipped me, but I think coming from like the music and the art side a lot, right, is, remember the labeling and category thing we were talking about earlier about the band name? Like, if Linkin Park had released, say, their One More Light album under a different name, it probably would have been done differently because it was branded differently. It didn't have the Linkin Park label, right? And like, let's say, Paul McCartney goes and does a rap album or something. I think, well, he's experimented enough where maybe he could kind of get away with it, but he may be better off if he just does it under a different name, right? And it's this interesting idea about how that labeling, the branding, the marketing of the service, the product, the whatever it is literally shaping your experience, right? And the thing about,
I mean, the thing with like a Paul McCartney thing, if he went off and did some entirely other thing and put it under a different name, it might very well fail simply because it doesn't have his name on it.
Correct.
And someone else who doesn't have a name might well go and do that same thing, and it would fail simply because they're not a known name. But if you put a known name on it, it's going to be successful.
Yeah.
And it does make you wonder about how the world works, right? There's probably
Yeah.
lots of great stuff out there that we never
Yeah.
get to see just because it hasn't come from a name.
Yeah.
Same with
Yeah.
scientists. I mean, there are probably lots of amazing scientific, like, for example, Michael Levin,
Yeah.
a lot of his work goes back. I can't remember the guy's name, but there is one scientist that he's
Yeah.
mined all of his works, and it goes
Yeah.
back to the 1930s or 1940s, who was basically, his work was basically unknown until Levin
Yeah.
picked it up and started working with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
guy could have gone into oblivion and never been known for what he did. And Michael
Bioelectricity guy?
Levin. Hmm?
Bioelectricity guy? That's
Um,
the scientist you
yes, and also not the bioelectricity guy, and also the morphogenesis guy that had all this
Yeah.
stuff about forms. I
Yeah. Yeah.
bought that book actually at quite some
Yeah.
expense because some of these old books are pretty expensive to get.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
point is, he's dragging up these people that were dying in
Yeah.
obscurity and making something with them. And there's probably a lot
Yeah.
of other work like that. One of the ones I think about that you might be interested in is George Adams. He
George
is,
Adams.
yeah, he was into projective geometry, and his work is super interesting. Well, I'll send you a link
Please do. Yeah.
because there are
Interesting.
probably lots
From
of
the
George Adams.
1700s?
No, no, no. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, I think.
George Adams.
Yeah. Project, maybe just look up projective geometry.
Got it. Projective geometry. George Adams Kaufman?
Yes. Well, sometimes he's
Got
known as George Adams and sometimes he's known as George Adams
got
Kaufman.
it. Got it.
Projective geometry. But I'll send you a link to one of his
Yeah.
books that's on an open source website. But this has
Interesting.
been great, Addy. We're going to have to
Yeah.
stop because we've been going for an hour and 45 minutes.
Got it. Got it.
I
As you know,
don't
I
have
could
the
go on for much
stamina
longer.
that Kurt does for 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
have an appointment that I've got to get to.
Got it.
But let's talk again for sure. What
Sure.
is your next event coming up?
There's there is no concrete date yet. There is the one that's happening that I'm helping organize with. It's the FAU Longevity Biotech Hackathon. It's this Friday, January 31st to Saturday, February 1st. We have Dr. Hanan Al-Hazan from the Levin Lab who will be presenting on bioelectricity. And that's only, those 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one will probably, we may have a small sort of philosophy salon event in between, but the next big one would ideally be the one with Michael Levin in some capacity and his group, probably somewhere around March or April. But nothing is concrete yet. There also may be a medical and healthcare hackathon happening at some point in the future. That would also relate to some of this, but that's not concrete yet as well. The things that are concrete is I'm going to keep posting videos of myself and other people that I find interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I plan to start releasing some more sort of visual art and music experiments also out into the open a bit more. And I really want to expand that olfactory language and all that type of stuff, which maybe we can talk about next time.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very excited for the community. We've got a Discord now. We've got the website. I've got the Twitter and the Instagram and all that, and it's gradually building. And I'm so pleased to hear that there are other people that are interested in this, and I'm just not off in some corner somewhere.
Yeah. Well, and partly because you're making it happen. You had an idea and you made it happen.
Right.
So
Yeah.
kudos
Perfect.
to that. I'm super impressed, and I may your tribe increase.
Thank you. Likewise for you. I can't. Hopefully the next time we'll talk, I'll have more interesting stories in the meantime. Since
Well, I mean, this whole thing has been fascinating. So
yeah,
really look forward. I mean, really appreciate the opportunity
yeah.
to talk to you, and look forward to the future. And have a great week. We'll talk soon.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye, Karen. Thank you. Bye.